Maurice Mcleod is CEO of Race on the Agenda. That's a social policy think tank focusing on issues that affect the BAME community. Also a former national newspaper journalist too. Maurice, afternoon to you, sir. Always good to have you on. Fleet Street is racist. That's a big statement. True or false?
So the short answer is true, but I know you're going to push back. So I always say, define what are you defining as racism? Because I think that's often a stumbling block.
I agree. We're in agreement straight away then, because that's exactly what I thought when I heard various voices come out yesterday and attack Ian Murray, a man who I wasn't familiar with at all. And in fact, despite doing this for a living, I wasn't even that familiar with the Society of Editors, to be honest. But I understand they're a body that you're perhaps more familiar with, that have hundreds of elements and members of it. So when people were suggesting that he shouldn't have made comments that he made saying that Fleet Street wasn't racist, I would take from that people were arguing, well, it demonstrably is racist.
Yeah, I mean, why I said it depends on your definition. Almost by whatever definition you're going to use for racism, it's very hard to argue that Fleet Street isn't racist, whether you talk about its makeup, whether you talk about its output. And I don't just mean the odd story that's offensive. I mean the general output of Fleet Street.
I wonder whether this is just through the eyes of a white guy, through the eyes of a black guy. Is there just a different emphasis or application of this word racism? Because if you said to me there are some parts of what we see in newspapers that you could construe as being certainly at best on the edge and sometimes racist, I'd be standing by you every day of the week. But that's a very different statement from saying that the whole thing as an entirety is racist, right?
Yes, so that's why I think it does come down to definitions. Because if you're saying articles that are specifically attacking of a particular group and use bad imagery or use pictures of monkeys or whatever, yeah, of course that's a rarity and it sometimes happens and the press gets pulled up for it when it does. I'm talking about the general. If you report on 100 cases of black people and 95 of them are something to do with crime, what you're doing is racist. You might not be a racist yourself. It might be a black journalist writing, whoever it does. But what you're doing, the result of what you're doing, is to encourage the idea that black people and crime are linked. So it's things like that are much harder to prove on an individual. That's why it always comes down to, show me the evidence, because
it's important though, isn't it, to look for it, because they're big accusations. It's the kind of catch-all phrase, racist, which I always put the caveat in, Maurice, as you know, that I can't walk in your shoes, but I can give it a good go intellectually of trying to understand something. And when you've just talked about how crime is reported, but if you're, for example, if you're reporting knife crime at the moment, then there would be clearly a greater chance that you would have more black names in there or cases of black kids than you would have white on that particular crime.
If you're reporting on knife crime in London or areas where there are large minority communities, if you're reporting on knife crime in Glasgow or some other area that maybe has a smaller minority community, then you'd be reporting on white people doing it. So there is still a choice, and let's not. There's this idea that journalism can be sort of objective. That doesn't exist. We all bring our experiences to the job. We all,
I agree. I agree with that. But how would that? Are we talking about all? You've worked on Fleet Street. You know how it works. I don't know what your experience was like there, but are we suggesting that editors are secret racists, or that journalists are all part of a shady cartel of clan members that secretly hate brown and black people? Is it that? Because that would be weird, right?
I'm pretty certain that no one's suggesting that, or what we're talking about. And don't get me wrong, there might well be individuals working in Fleet Street who do have really strong racism.
I'm sure.
That might be the case. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the system. So when you say journalism or anything is systemically racist, is institutionally racist, it doesn't mean all of the individuals that work there are sort of pointy hat wearing cross burners. It means that the impact of that industry is negative on particular races based on their race. that it's really hard to argue that journalism doesn't do that, or many other institutions in the UK.
But would it be also fair to say that in a world or in a country that is still mostly white, you are going to get, in terms of staff, for example? I mean, it's not. I don't know what the turnover rate of journalists is in this country, but I remember speaking to somebody about a year ago on this, and they said their department in one particular area of a national newspaper has had the same staff for 10 years. So they're all white people, because that's how it's been. And if nobody's leaving, no one's replacing them. So it's not that much of a surprise you might have a disproportionate amount of white people in an institution like Fleet Street, right?
Possibly you could use that as a way of explaining the really stubborn lack of diversity on Fleet Street. I'm talking about, because it's still the case that sort of 0.4 British journalists are Muslim, where they make up 3% of the population. There's loads of disparities.
There's a journey to be had there, though, isn't there? There's a massive journey. It's not going to happen instantly.
But I'm not really convinced that there's been much. I mean, I started journalism nearly 30 years ago. I'm not really sure that there's been much movement in that direction anyway. The movement has come. I think there are more diverse faces. Absolutely. There are more diverse faces, popping up on TV and in adverts. That's absolutely the case. Has the actual tone of the coverage changed a hell of a lot? I'm not sure. There's been improvements, but
what do you pick up, Maurice, from a newspaper? I mean, you mentioned something about crime there, but look, normally when I look at even the Daily Mail, I know sometimes the Mail and Express, and there's this fun game you can have on Twitter, and that's to take a collection of their front pages over the last 5,000 years and put 50 of them together and go, look, they talked about immigrants, which doesn't in itself prove racism. There might be some questionable headlines in there, but often it's just a conversation about race or asylum. Just using the word doesn't make it racist, of course. So I'm trying to think, when I pick up a Daily Mail and look through it, what I would, I see a lot of black faces on the Mail online in very positive stories. So what is it that I'm missing? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing?
Yeah, again, it's really hard to sort of pull back, not look at individual stories, but pull back and look at the output of the media. Look at the output, especially of papers like the Mail. I used to work on the Express. Look at the output of the Daily Express. If you can say, oh, of course, that's just one story about a negative story about an asylum seeker, or that's just another one. When you pile them all up and you go, well, hang on, how big an issue is asylum in this country, and how much coverage is it getting in this paper, and why is it getting that sort of coverage? Because it ticks the right buttons for their readers, and it gets people to click on the stories and be interested and be enraged about, I don't know, asylum seekers eating swans or some other made up bit of nonsense. Yeah. That when you pull back and look from afar, it's really hard to ignore that our media does have those slants. And
okay.
I think...
All right. Now, Maurice, on that point, thank you. It's been a nice measured discussion. I appreciate that. Maurice Mcleod, CEO of Race on the Agenda.